In 1973, the average American worker could buy a house for 3 times their annual salary. Today, that same house costs 8 times their annual salary. But here's the part that doesn't make sense. Workers today are dramatically more productive than workers in 1973. They have computers, automation, and 50 years of technological advancement. By every measure, they're creating more value per hour than any generation in history. So where did the money go? Because the gap between what workers produce and what workers earn is now the widest it's been in a century. And it's not an accident. It's the result of dozens of deliberate policy decisions that fundamentally rewired how the economy distributes wealth. This is the story of the greatest heist in economic history. Except nobody broke any laws. They just changed the rules. Let's start with a number that should make you uncomfortable. If the minimum wage had kept pace with productivity growth since 1968, it would be over $25 an hour today. Instead, it's $7.25 in most states. That's not a small gap. That's the difference between living paycheck to paycheck and actually building wealth. And it's not just minimum wage workers. The median worker, the person right in the middle of the income distribution, has seen their real wages barely move in 50 years. Meanwhile, corporate profits as a share of GDP have nearly doubled. CEO pay has increased by over 1,300%, and the stock market has grown so much that the wealthiest 10% of Americans now own 93% of all stocks. Something broke in the early 1970s, and instead of fixing it, we built an entire economy around the broken piece. To understand what happened, you need to look at 1973, not because it's a clean starting point, but because that's when several economic trends hit at once. First, the post-war boom ended. For nearly 3 decades after World War II, productivity and wages moved together almost perfectly. When companies made more money, workers got paid more. It was the closest thing to a fair deal that capitalism has ever produced. But in 1973, oil prices quadrupled, inflation spiked, the economy entered a recession, and suddenly the old model stopped working. Corporations faced a choice. They could preserve the social contract and accept lower profits, or they could break the link between productivity and pay. They chose option 2. What followed was the most dramatic restructuring of economic power in modern history. It happened quietly, through policy changes that sound boring but had massive consequences. Union membership peaked in the 1950s at about 35% of workers. By 1983, it was cut in half. Today, it's barely 10%. And this wasn't natural decline, it was policy. The government stopped enforcing labor protections. States passed right-to-work laws. Companies started firing workers for trying to organize. And slowly, the one institution that could actually bargain for higher wages disappeared. Without unions, workers lost leverage. And without leverage, their share of corporate profits started to shrink. But union decline alone doesn't explain the gap. Something deeper changed in how companies think about labor. In the 1970s, a new theory took over corporate America. It was called shareholder primacy. The idea was simple. A company's only responsibility is to maximize value for shareholders, not workers, not communities, just investors. This sounds like a technical detail. It's not. Because once shareholder value became the only metric that mattered, every other consideration became negotiable. Workers weren't people to invest in, they were costs to minimize. So companies started offshoring jobs to countries with lower wages. They replaced full-time employees with contractors who got no benefits. They automated positions and pocketed the savings instead of redistributing them. And here's the part that makes it impossible to escape. They made sure workers had no alternatives. Non-compete agreements exploded, trapping people in their industries. Consolidation reduced the number of employers in most sectors, killing competition for labor. And wage-fixing schemes, where companies secretly agreed not to poach each other's workers, became routine. Apple, Google, Intel, and Adobe all got caught doing this. They paid a settlement and moved on. The practice continues. The result is a labor market that looks competitive, but isn't. Workers are told to negotiate for higher pay, but they're negotiating in a system designed to suppress wages. So if workers aren't getting paid more, where is all that productivity growth going? The answer is simple. It's going up. Between 1979 and 2020, worker productivity increased by 61%. Compensation for the top 0.1% increased by 345%. That's not a typo. The people at the very top captured 5 times more gains than productivity itself. This happened through several mechanisms. First, stock-based compensation. When executives get paid in stock options, they benefit directly from keeping labor costs down. Firing workers makes the stock price go up, which makes executives richer. The incentive structure is designed to extract value from labor and transfer it to capital. Second, financialization. Companies used to reinvest profits into growth, research, and employee development. Now they use profits to buy back stock, which inflates share prices without creating anything new. Over the last decade, S&P 500 companies spent over $5 trillion on buybacks. That's money that could have gone to wages. Third, automation gains stayed with owners. When a factory automates a production line and cuts the workforce in half, the remaining workers don't get paid twice as much. The owners pocket the difference. This is the core mechanism. Productivity gains that used to be shared between labor and capital are now captured almost entirely by capital. And because wealth compounds, the gap accelerates. The rich use their gains to buy assets that appreciate. Workers use their stagnant wages to pay rent, which also goes to asset owners. The system feeds itself. Now, some people will tell you this is just how markets work, that wages are set by supply and demand, and if workers want more money, they need more skills. That's a lie. Wages aren't set by markets, they're set by power. And every policy decision since the 1970s has shifted power away from workers. Start with taxes. In 1960, the top marginal tax rate was 91%. By 1988, it was 28%. The idea was that lower taxes would create growth that would trickle down to everyone. It didn't. GDP grew, productivity grew, but worker wages stagnated because there was no mechanism to distribute those gains. The wealthy just kept more of the money. Then there's monetary policy. When inflation rises, central banks raise interest rates, which slows the economy and increases unemployment. This is deliberate. The theory is that if workers have less bargaining power, they'll stop demanding raises and inflation will cool. In other words, the primary tool for controlling inflation is making workers poorer. Housing policy made it worse. Zoning laws restricted housing supply in productive cities, causing prices to skyrocket. Now, workers spend 30, 40, sometimes 50% of their income on rent. That's money that can't be saved. That's money that doesn't build wealth. And education costs exploded. In 1980, you could work part-time over the summer and pay for a year of college. Today, The average graduate leaves school with $30,000 in debt. So even the people who followed the rules and got the skills are starting their careers underwater. None of this was inevitable. These were choices. Here's what happens when an entire generation realizes the economy doesn't work for them. First, they stop participating. Home ownership among young adults has collapsed. Marriage rates are dropping. Birth rates are falling. These aren't cultural shifts, they're economic responses. You can't start a family when rent takes half your paycheck and childcare costs more than college. You can't buy a house when prices rise faster than you can save. And you can't plan for the future when every financial milestone your parents hit in their 20s now happens in your 40s, if it happens at all.
Second, trust in institutions collapses. When people see their parents' generation succeed with high school diplomas, while they struggle with master's degrees, they stop believing the system is fair. And they're right. It's not fair. It's rigged. Third, political instability increases. When large portions of the population feel economically abandoned, they look for answers. Sometimes those answers are constructive. Sometimes they're not. Populism, on both the left and right, is a direct response to wage stagnation. So is the rise of conspiracy thinking. When the official explanation for why you're struggling is you didn't work hard enough, but you're working 2 jobs and still can't afford rent, you start looking for alternative explanations. Some of those explanations are correct. The system is rigged. Some are dangerous. But they all come from the same place, a sense that the rules changed and nobody asked permission. So why hasn't this been fixed? Because the people who benefit from the current system are the same people who control policy. Corporations lobby to keep minimum wage low. Wealthy donors fund politicians who cut taxes on capital gains. Media outlets owned by billionaires frame wage increases as inflationary and dangerous. And most importantly, the problem is diffuse enough that it's hard to organize against. If your wages haven't increased in 20 years, you might think it's just you. You might think you're in the wrong industry, or you didn't get the right degree, or you're not working hard enough. But when you zoom out, you see it's everyone. Nurses, teachers, factory workers, truck drivers, even many white-collar professionals. Entire sectors where pay has stagnated while costs have exploded. The system works exactly as designed. It extracts value from labor and concentrates it at the top. And it does so in a way that makes workers blame themselves instead of the structure. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Your salary hasn't changed since 1973 because someone decided it shouldn't. Not because you're not productive enough, not because you don't have the right skills, but because the economy was deliberately restructured to prioritize capital over labor. And it worked. Corporate profits are at record highs. Billionaire wealth has exploded. The stock market keeps hitting new peaks. By every measure that matters to the people in power, the system is functioning perfectly. The question isn't whether this is sustainable, it's whether it's tolerable. Because at some point, an economy that doesn't reward work stops being a meritocracy and starts being something else. And the longer this continues, the harder it becomes to imagine a path back to a system where productivity and pay actually move together. Right now, we're running an experiment. We're testing how long you can run an economy where the majority of people work harder every year and get paid the same, where the gap between effort and reward keeps widening. No one knows how it ends, but history suggests economies like this don't stay stable forever.